I'll create a compelling 4-chapter story based on Ethan's journey from being bullied for his weight to becoming a successful personal trainer. Each chapter will be approximately 1,100 words, written in English, and will focus on realistic emotional development while maintaining cultural relevance to the American context. Chapter 1. The fluorescent lights of Jefferson High's hallway seemed to buzz louder whenever Ethan Walker walked beneath them. At 17, he'd perfected the art of moving through school with his eyes down, shoulders hunched, trying to occupy as little space as possible despite his 280-pound frame. It never worked. "Hey, eats a ton. Save some oxygen for the rest of us." Brad Coleman's voice echoed down the corridor, followed by the predictable chorus of laughter. Brad, the school's star quarterback with perfect teeth and a Letterman jacket that seemed permanently attached to his broad shoulders, had made Ethan his personal punching bag since 6th grade. Ethan clutched his books tighter against his chest and quickened his pace toward biology class. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from exertion, but from the familiar mixture of shame and anger that had become his constant companion. Miss Reynolds, his biology teacher, was one of the few people at Jefferson High who saw past Ethan's size. "You have a brilliant mind," she'd told him last semester. "Don't let anyone convince you that your worth is measured by a scale." He slid into his seat at the back of the classroom just as the bell rang. The chair creaked beneath him, a sound that would have once sent him into a spiral of self-loathing. Today, he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on the college brochures hidden in his backpack. 6 months until graduation, 6 months until he could leave Millfield, Pennsylvania, behind. "Today we're discussing metabolic processes," Ms. Reynolds announced, writing on the whiteboard. "Ethan, you were reading ahead last week. Want to tell us about ATP synthesis?" Before Ethan could respond, a whispered comment floated from 2 rows ahead. "Like he needs more energy to make fat." The classroom rippled with suppressed laughter. Ms. Reynolds shot a warning glance in the direction of the comment, but the damage was done. Ethan's face burned as he stared at his textbook, the diagrams blurring before his eyes. Later that afternoon, Ethan pushed his lunch tray away half-eaten, despite his hunger. The cafeteria was a minefield of judgment. Eat too much, and he confirmed their mockery. Eat too little, and they'd still find something to criticize. His best friend Maya slid onto the bench across from him, her dark curls bouncing as she dropped her tray with dramatic flair. "The debate team's going to nationals," she announced. "And guess who's been selected as team captain?" Ethan managed a genuine smile. "That's amazing, Maya. You deserve it." Maya had been his only real friend since elementary school, back when kids were still kind. She'd stood by him through everything, fiercely protective and stubbornly loyal. "You should join next year in college," she said, stealing one of his untouched fries. "You're smarter than all of them combined." Ethan shrugged. Maybe, but his attention had drifted to the table where the athletes sat. Brad was there, arm around his girlfriend Cassidy, who had once been Ethan's friend in middle school before social hierarchies solidified. She caught his eye briefly before looking away, a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossing her face. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table helping his younger sister Emma with her math homework. Their small house on the edge of town was modest but warm, filled with the smell of his mother's chicken casserole baking in the oven. His father, a construction foreman with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, read the newspaper across from them. "You're getting really good at these problems," Ethan told Emma, who beamed at the praise. His phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged him in a post. His stomach clenched as he opened the app to find a photo taken in the cafeteria without his knowledge. Ethan hunched over his lunch tray, an unflattering angle that emphasized his double chin and the strain of his shirt buttons. The caption read, "Whale watching at Jefferson High to save the tables." The comments were worse, much worse. Ethan's hands trembled as he closed the app, a cold hollowness spreading through his chest. Emma, oblivious to her brother's distress, continued chattering about her teacher's new puppy. That night, lying in bed, Ethan stared at his ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars, relics from his childhood fascination with astronomy, formed constellations only he recognized. The social media post had accumulated more likes, more comments. His entire school life had been a series of moments like this, each one chipping away at whatever self-worth he managed to build. He rolled onto his side, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded tears he refused to shed. On his nightstand sat the latest letter from State University, his ticket out. He'd already been accepted with a partial scholarship based on his academic performance. Just 6 more months, but something felt different tonight. The hollowness had been replaced by a smoldering ember of defiance. Why should he wait for college to start living? Why should Brad and his crew dictate how he felt about himself for one more day? Ethan reached for his phone and opened a new browser tab. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, "How to start losing weight as a teenager." The search returned millions of results, overwhelming in their variety and often contradictory advice. But one comment in a forum caught his eye. "The best exercise program is the one you'll actually stick with." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not just anger or resignation, but a spark of possibility. He continued reading late into the night, his mind racing with new information about nutrition, exercise science, and metabolic processes. Ironically, the very subject from biology class that had been used to mock him. Dawn was breaking when Ethan finally set his phone down. He'd made a decision. This wouldn't be about proving anything to Brad or becoming suddenly attractive to people like Cassidy. This would be about taking control of his life on his own terms. About discovering what his body was capable of when he stopped hating it and started working with it instead. As the first golden rays of sunlight filtered through his blinds, Ethan Walker took a deep breath and got out of bed. He found an old pair of sneakers in his closet and a baggy t-shirt that would hide the worst of his self-consciousness. Then, heart pounding with both fear and determination, he stepped outside for what would become the first of thousands of morning walks. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Ethan's journey was just beginning. Chapter 2. 5 years later, Ethan stood in front of the full-length mirror at Elevate Fitness, adjusting his new trainer uniform, a fitted black polo that highlighted shoulders that had broadened through years of consistent training. At 22, he barely resembled the teenager who had once avoided reflections. His body, now a solid 195 pounds, told the story of his transformation, not just in the visible muscle definition, but in the confidence with which he carried himself. "Earth to Ethan," called a voice from the doorway. "Your 9 o'clock is here. New client evaluation." Ethan turned to see Zoe, the gym's receptionist, leaning against the doorframe. Her knowing smile suggested she'd caught him in a moment of self-appreciation. "Thanks, Zoe. I'll be right out." The journey to this moment had been anything but straight or easy. College had provided the fresh start he desperately needed, a place where no one knew about "eats a ton" or had seen those humiliating social media posts. He'd arrived at State University still overweight, but committed to his new lifestyle of daily walks and portion control. It was in his freshman year physical education requirement that he'd met Professor Martinez, a former Olympic weightlifter turned exercise physiologist. The professor had noticed Ethan's determination during class and approached him afterward. "You're consistent," he'd said simply. "That's rare. Most people want results without the work." Those words had changed everything. Under Professor Martinez's guidance, Ethan had learned proper form, progressive overload principles, and the science behind body composition changes. More importantly, he discovered that his body was not an enemy to be conquered, but a complex system to be understood and respected. Now, as a certified personal trainer with a degree in exercise science, Ethan faced his newest challenge, building his client base at Portland's most exclusive fitness center. 3 months into the job, he was still proving himself, taking whatever clients the more established trainers passed over. Ethan walked into the consultation room to find his new client, a nervous-looking woman in her 40s who immediately began apologizing for her athletic wear, her fitness level, her very presence. "I've never done anything like this," she admitted, avoiding eye contact. "My doctor said I need to lose 50 pounds, but I've tried everything. I probably shouldn't even be here." Something in her voice transported Ethan back to his own beginnings, the vulnerability, the shame, the certainty of failure before even starting. He sat down across from her, deliberately making himself smaller, less intimidating. "Mrs. Chen," he said gently, "can I share something with you? 5 years ago, I weighed almost 300 pounds. I couldn't run to the end of my driveway without getting winded. The first time I tried to do a push-up, I couldn't even lower myself halfway down." Her eyes widened slightly, disbelief evident as she took in his current physique. "Everyone starts somewhere," he continued. "The people you see in this gym who look like they've got it all figured out, they all had a first day too. And if you'll trust me, I'll make sure your journey is about more than just losing weight. It'll be about discovering what you're capable of." By the end of the consultation, Mrs. Chen had signed up for twice-weekly sessions for 3 months. As Ethan walked her out, scheduling their first official training session, he felt the familiar satisfaction of connecting with someone who needed exactly what he had to offer. Not just exercise instruction, but understanding. During his lunch break, Ethan scrolled through his social media, where his fitness account had slowly gained traction. Nothing viral, but a steady growth of followers drawn to his no-nonsense approach and emphasis on sustainable habits. His latest post, a before and after comparison with a caption about patience and consistency, had generated considerable engagement. One comment caught his eye. "Weren't you that fat kid from Jefferson High? Total glow-up, dude." Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen. The comment wasn't malicious, but it reopened a door to a past he'd worked hard to process. Millfield and Jefferson High existed now primarily in his memory, occasionally refreshed by Maya's updates when they caught up over video calls. She was in law school now, still fiercely protective, even from a distance. He chose not to respond to the comment. His transformation had never been about validation from people who knew him before. Still, the question lingered as he finished his protein-packed lunch and prepared for his afternoon clients. Later that evening, as Ethan locked up his locker after his own workout, his phone rang with an unknown number from his hometown area code. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Is this Ethan Walker? It's Principal Hargrove from Jefferson High." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Principal Hargrove had been relatively new during his senior year, well-meaning but ultimately ineffective at addressing the bullying culture that had thrived at Jefferson. "Yes, this is Ethan. No, I hope you don't mind the call. Your former teacher, Ms. Reynolds, suggested I reach out. We're organizing a 10-year anniversary event for the school's health and wellness program, and we're looking for alumni with expertise in the field to speak to our current students about career paths. Your name came up." The irony wasn't lost on Ethan, being invited back as a success story to the very place that had once been the source of his deepest insecurities. His instinct was to decline immediately, to protect the peace he'd found by putting literal and emotional distance between himself and Millfield. "I understand if you're not interested," Principal Hargrove continued into the silence. "Ms. Reynolds mentioned that your time at Jefferson wasn't always positive, an understatement of epic proportions. Can I think about it?" Ethan finally asked. "Of course, the event is in 3 months. Just let us know by the end of the month." After hanging up, Ethan sat on the bench in the empty locker room, memories flooding back, the cafeteria incidents, the gym class humiliations, the hallway taunts, but also Miss Reynolds' unwavering support, Maya's fierce friendship, and the quiet determination that had been born in those difficult years. What would it mean to go back, not as the insecure teenager desperate to escape, but as the man he'd become. What would it mean to stand before a new generation of students, some undoubtedly struggling as he had, and offer living proof that their current circumstances didn't define their potential? Ethan didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, he was considering the possibility that his story might have value beyond his personal journey, that the very experiences he'd worked so hard to overcome might be the foundation for something more meaningful than he'd imagined. As he walked to his apartment that evening, the crisp Portland air filled his lungs. 5 years of consistent effort had changed more than his body. It had changed how he moved through the world, with purpose, with confidence, and increasingly with a desire to help others find their own path forward. Chapter 3. The Jefferson High Gymnasium hadn't changed in the slightest. Same scuffed hardwood floors, same faded championship banners from the 1990s, same slightly musty smell of adolescent sweat and industrial cleaning products. What had changed, profoundly, was Ethan's relationship to this space. 10 years ago, this gym had been the site of his most acute humiliations. Today, he stood at the center of it, a microphone in hand, facing 200 students who actually seemed to be listening to him. "Transformation isn't about hating who you are," Ethan said, his voice stronger than he'd anticipated. "It's about respecting yourself enough to become the person you're capable of being." From the back of the gymnasium, Ms. Reynolds, now Department Chair Reynolds, with streaks of grey in her once auburn hair, gave him an encouraging nod. It had been her persistent emails following Principal Hargrove's call that had ultimately convinced Ethan to return to Jefferson High. The decision hadn't come easily. For weeks after the invitation, Ethan had wrestled with conflicting emotions. The professional opportunity versus the emotional risk, the chance to make a difference versus the possibility of reopening old wounds. In the end, it was a session with Mrs. Chen that had tipped the scales. 3 months into their training, she'd accomplished what she'd once thought impossible, completing a full mile on the treadmill without stopping. As she'd stood there, bent over with hands on knees, tears mixing with sweat, she'd looked up at him and said, "I wish someone had shown me this was possible when I was younger. It would have changed everything." Those words had echoed in Ethan's mind as he'd finally called Principal Hargrove to accept the invitation. If his story could shift even one student's perspective about their own potential, perhaps it was worth revisiting the past he'd worked so hard to leave behind. Now, as he concluded his presentation about careers in fitness and wellness, the questions began. Most were predictable, about college programs, certification requirements, and salary expectations. Then a hand rose from the middle row, a heavy-set boy in a gaming t-shirt, his expression a careful mask of indifference that Ethan recognized all too well. "Did you always want to be a trainer, or was it just because you lost weight?" The question cut through the professional veneer, straight to the heart of Ethan's journey. He took a moment before answering, aware that his response mattered far beyond career guidance. "Actually, when I was sitting where you are, I wanted to be an astronomer," Ethan admitted. "I had glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling and could name every constellation, but I didn't believe someone like me belonged in that world." He paused, noticing how the boy shifted slightly, eyes now fixed on him with careful attention. "What changed wasn't just my body. It was realizing that I could set a goal and achieve it through consistent effort. That realization transferred to everything else in my life. I discovered I had a passion for helping others find that same confidence. So no, I didn't always want to be a trainer, but I always wanted to matter, to contribute something meaningful. We all do." After the presentation, as students filed out for their next classes, the boy approached Ethan cautiously. "I'm Kevin," he said simply. "My mom's trying all these diets, but nothing works for her. She gets really sad about it." The vulnerability in those few sentences was unmistakable. Ethan recognized in Kevin not just his younger self, but the ripple effects of fitness struggles, how they impacted families, relationships, and developing identities. The diet industry makes billions by selling quick fixes, Ethan told him. But sustainable change comes from small, consistent habits that you can maintain for life. It's not as exciting as dropping 20 pounds in a month, but it actually works. He wrote down the name of a podcast focused on evidence-based nutrition and his professional email address. If your mum's interested, tell her she can reach out. No pressure, no sales pitch. As Kevin walked away, Department Chair Reynolds approached with a knowing smile. "You found your calling," she observed. "Not many people can connect with teenagers that authentically." "I just remember what it was like," Ethan replied, "to feel simultaneously invisible and painfully visible. To believe your worth was tied to your appearance." "Speaking of the past," she said carefully, "there's someone who'd like to say hello, if you're comfortable with that." Ethan followed her gaze to the gymnasium doorway, where a woman with familiar features waited hesitantly. Cassidy, no longer the popular cheerleader, but a poised adult in business casual attire. The years had been kind to her, though there was a maturity in her expression that hadn't been there in high school. His first instinct was avoidance. Cassidy hadn't been among the worst of his tormentors, but her silence, in the face of Brad's cruelty, had been its own kind of betrayal. They'd been friends once, before social status became everything. But Ethan wasn't 17 anymore, desperate for approval or nursing grievances. With a deep breath, he nodded to Ms. Reynolds and crossed the gymnasium. "Ethan," Cassidy said, her voice tinged with nervous energy, "it's really good to see you." "Thanks for coming," he replied neutrally. "Are you teaching here now?" She shook her head. "School board. I attend all the career events." A pause, then, "Your presentation was fantastic. Really powerful." An awkward silence stretched between them, weighted with unspoken history. Finally, Cassidy spoke again, words tumbling out in a rush. "I've wanted to apologize for years, for not standing up for you, for caring more about fitting in than doing what was right. I was a coward, and I've regretted it every time I think about high school." The directness of her apology caught Ethan off guard. In his imagination, encounters with people from his past had always been triumphant moments of vindication, chances to showcase his transformation and perhaps inspire a bit of regret from those who dismissed him. He hadn't prepared for genuine remorse. "We were all trying to survive high school in our own ways," he said finally. "I appreciate the apology, but it was a long time ago." Cassidy studied his face carefully. "You've changed more than just physically," she observed. "There's a peace about you now." "It didn't come easily," Ethan admitted, "but somewhere along the way, I realized that holding on to resentment was just another way of giving power to the past." They spoke for a few more minutes, about her work with the school board, his growing client list in Portland, mutual acquaintances from their graduating class. It was surprisingly comfortable, this conversation with someone who had known him before, during the hardest chapter of his life. As they parted ways, Cassidy hesitated. "There's a small alumni gathering tonight at Riverside Brewery. Nothing formal, just a few people from our year. You'd be welcome to join us." Ethan considered the invitation. Part of him wanted to decline, to maintain the careful distance he'd established from his hometown. But another part, the part that had agreed to this speaking engagement in the first place, recognized the opportunity to rewrite his relationship with Millfield on new terms. "I might stop by," he said. "Thanks for the invitation." That evening, as Ethan prepared to meet his past head-on, he reflected on the day's events. The students' engagement, Kevin's quiet vulnerability, Cassidy's unexpected apology, all of it painted a picture of possibility he hadn't anticipated when he'd reluctantly agreed to return. Perhaps coming back wasn't just about closing old chapters. Perhaps it was about discovering that the story was richer, more complex, and ultimately more redemptive than he'd allowed himself to believe. Chapter 4. The Riverside Brewery hummed with conversation and laughter as Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden door. The establishment was new since his time in Millfield, a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, and long communal tables that encouraged mingling. Cassidy had mentioned a small gathering, but at least 30 people filled the space, many faces vaguely familiar from his high school yearbook. Ethan hesitated at the threshold, a momentary flashback to cafeteria entrances and the familiar calculation of where to sit, how to appear as though he belonged. Then he straightened his shoulders and moved forward. This wasn't high school. He wasn't that person anymore. Cassidy spotted him immediately, waving from a table near the back. As Ethan made his way through the crowd, he noticed the double takes, the whispered conversations, the surprised recognition spreading across faces. He'd expected this, had prepared himself for being a walking before and after photo, but the reality still felt surreal. "You came!" Cassidy greeted him warmly, pulling out a chair. "Everyone, you remember Ethan Walker, right?" The small group at the table included faces from his past. Jessica from his AP English class, Michael, who'd run track, and surprisingly, Maya, who launched herself at him in a fierce hug. "You didn't tell me you were coming home," she accused, punching his arm lightly. "I had to hear it from the Jefferson High newsletter." "Last-minute decision," Ethan explained, genuinely happy to see his oldest friend in person rather than through a screen. "I thought you were buried in law school casework." "Even future attorneys need weekends," she retorted. "Besides, I wouldn't miss a chance to see the prodigal son's triumphant return." The conversation flowed more easily than Ethan had anticipated. They discussed careers, travel, the changes to Millfield over the years. No one directly mentioned his transformation, though it hung in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of the most visible change since graduation. An hour into the evening, Ethan was midway through a story about a disastrous first date in Portland when a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A group of loud, slightly intoxicated men had arrived, their boisterous energy immediately dominating the space. Ethan recognized Brad Coleman instantly, older, with a slight thickening around the middle that his expensive button-down couldn't quite disguise, but still carrying himself with the entitled confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Maya's hand found Ethan's under the table, a silent question. "Are you okay?" He gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze. The sight of Brad didn't trigger the old anxiety, the old shame. Instead, Ethan felt a strange detachment, almost curiosity, about the man who had once held such power over his daily existence. Inevitably, Brad's gaze swept the room and landed on their table. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by visible disbelief as he registered Ethan's presence and appearance. "Holy shit!" he announced loudly to his companions. "Is that Eats-a-Ton Walker?" The nickname hit Ethan like a physical blow, not because it still hurt, but because it revealed how little Brad had grown since high school. While Ethan had transformed his entire life, Brad was still playing the same tired role from a decade ago. A tense silence fell over their table as Brad made his way over, drink in hand, trademark smirk firmly in place. "Look at you," he said, gesturing expansively at Ethan. "Who would have thought the fat kid would end up with abs? What did you do? Get surgery?" "Good to see you too, Brad," Ethan replied evenly. "Still leading with your personality, I see." Maya snorted into her beer while Cassidy looked mortified. Brad seemed thrown by Ethan's composure. He'd clearly expected either avoidance or eagerness to please, the old dynamics reasserting themselves. When neither materialized, he doubled down. "Seriously, though, you look completely different. Must be nice to finally not break chairs when you sit down." In that moment, Ethan had a choice. He could match Brad's pettiness, could deliver any number of cutting remarks about peaking in high school or the receding hairline that Brad was unsuccessfully trying to hide. The old wounds beckoned, offering the satisfaction of finally striking back. Instead, Ethan stood up, bringing himself to eye level with his former tormentor. "You know what's interesting, Brad? 10 years ago, your opinion of me was the most important thing in my world. Tonight, it's barely a footnote." He extended his hand, offering a handshake rather than a confrontation. "I hope life's treating you well." The gesture visibly confused Brad, who hesitantly accepted the handshake. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been respect, or perhaps simply the recognition that the power dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. "Yeah, can't complain," Brad mumbled, suddenly awkward. "Got the dealership from my dad. Married Melissa Jenkins. You remember her, right? Got 2 kids now." "Congratulations," Ethan said sincerely. "That's great." And then an uncomfortable silence followed before Brad nodded vaguely and retreated to his own group, considerably subdued. When Ethan sat back down, Maya was looking at him with something like awe. "When did you become a Zen master?" she whispered. The old Ethan would have either hidden in the bathroom or dreamed about punching him for weeks afterward. The old Ethan was fighting battles inside himself, he replied quietly. This version doesn't need to fight anymore. Later that night, as the gathering began to disperse, Ethan stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The Millfield sky was clearer than Portland's, stars scattered across the darkness in familiar patterns. He found himself automatically locating Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper, the constellations from his childhood ceiling. The brewery door opened behind him, and Cassidy joined him on the sidewalk, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the evening chill. "That was impressive, what you did in there," she said. "With Brad." Ethan shrugged. "It wasn't about impressing anyone." "I know. That's what made it impressive." She hesitated before continuing. "You could have made him feel as small as he once made you feel. No one would have blamed you." "What would that have accomplished?" Ethan asked. "Making someone else feel terrible doesn't undo the past. It just creates more of the same cycle." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching cars pass on the quiet street. "So," Cassidy finally said, "Principal Hargrove mentioned there might be an opening for a wellness coordinator at Jefferson next year, part of their expanded health initiative. Any chance Portland might lose you to your hometown?" The question caught Ethan by surprise. He'd planned this trip as a brief return, a chance to face his past before returning to the life he'd built elsewhere. The possibility of coming back permanently hadn't crossed his mind. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I've built something good in Portland." "Think about it," Cassidy urged. "What you did for those students today, especially kids like Kevin, that doesn't happen every day. Teachers spend their whole careers hoping to make that kind of impact." The next morning, as Ethan packed his suitcase in his childhood bedroom, now converted to a guest room, though his mother had kept the glow-in-the-dark stars intact, he found himself considering Cassidy's words. His life in Portland was comfortable, successful by external measures. His client list was growing, his social media following expanding. But something about yesterday's interaction with Kevin had stirred a deeper sense of purpose. The boy had emailed him already, sharing that he and his mother had listened to the recommended podcast together and were talking about sustainable changes they could make as a family. One email, one life potentially changed. What might be possible if he dedicated himself to that kind of impact? As Ethan zipped his suitcase closed, his phone chimed with a notification, a direct message on his fitness account from an unfamiliar username. "You spoke at my school yesterday. We've been thinking about what you said about consistent small changes. Where do I start?" Another message followed quickly. "This is Kevin BTW from Jefferson." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, thumbs hovering over the keyboard. The easy answer would be to recommend beginner workout videos, basic nutrition principles, the standard fitness influencer response. But Kevin wasn't just seeking fitness advice. He was reaching out for connection, for understanding from someone who'd walked a similar path. Before responding, Ethan opened his gallery and scrolled back through years of photos until he found what he was looking for, a picture from his freshman year of college, still overweight but standing at the entrance to his dorm, eyes bright with possibility. It wasn't a dramatic transformation photo, just a moment of genuine beginning. He attached the photo to his response, "Start by believing you're worth the effort. Everything else follows from there. And Kevin, you are absolutely worth the effort." As he pressed send, Ethan realized the truth that had been quietly taking shape throughout this journey home. His transformation had never been about proving the bullies wrong or becoming conventionally attractive. It had been about reclaiming his own narrative, about discovering that his worth had been present all along, waiting for him to recognize it beneath the layers of others' judgments and his own self-doubt. Perhaps that was the real story worth sharing. Not just how to change your body, but how to change your relationship with yourself. Not just how to lose weight, but how to find your value independent of appearance. Ethan glanced up at the plastic stars on his ceiling, faded now, but still visible in the morning light. The boy who had placed them there had believed in infinite possibilities above him, even when he couldn't see them in himself. As Ethan Walker left his childhood home and drove toward the airport, the path ahead seemed suddenly wider, filled with more possibilities than he'd allowed himself to imagine. Whether his future would unfold in Portland or Millfield or somewhere entirely new remained to be seen. What was certain was this: he was no longer defined by who he had been, nor limited by what others had once believed about him. His story was still being written, and for perhaps the first time, he was truly holding the pen.